Good day, everyone. My name is Lebogang Peto. I'm a master's student in economics at the NWU. It is my honor to welcome you all to the 2021 Northwest University's Race Awareness Week. It is particularly important for us all, not just economists, to consider the relationship between race and the economy. It is necessary for us to recognize progress that has been made in South Africa to uplift people who have been previously disadvantaged. The World Bank's Overcoming Poverty and Inequality report shows us the latest available data, which indicates that around 2.3 million South Africans have escaped poverty between 2006 and 2015. While the coronavirus will have worsened the state of poverty in South Africa, especially along the lines of race, it is worth reflecting on the gains that have been made. But there's still much to be done. Just before the pandemic in 2019, we still had massive inequalities in terms of unemployment. Black Africans were reported as having 43% unemployment rate. Colored people were reported as having 30.1% unemployment rate. Indian people's unemployment rate was 20.6%, while white people's had only 9% unemployment rate. Startling statistics are also reflected in earning differentials, where Black Africans on average still earn less than what half of white people earn in South Africa. So too, a breakdown of the Black African workforce reveals that 18% are considered skilled workers, while in the case of whites in South Africa, the skilled workforce is 61%. These statistics emphasize that 3 centuries of colonialism and half a century of apartheid have left South Africa with massive challenge of changing the structural inequalities embedded within our economy and indeed our society. One of the main reasons for us hosting these cross-curricular events during RAW is to augment our learning outside of the classroom. This week is an opportunity for us all to learn, wake up, and to reflect. We encourage everyone attending this session to acknowledge that as a community that encourages intellectual discourse, that we need to ask the hard questions, but that we always remain respectful. That we push to understand better, but also know when to listen better. That you embrace being comfortable with the uncomfortable. As you watch the contributions made by the various speaker or speakers in each session, please feel free, not just to type questions, but even your thoughts and reflections in the chat box. You don't have to wait for the discussion section of the session. Please contribute via text from the moment we start with the session. If you are enthusiastic about unmuting your mic, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. If time allows, the facilitator will encourage you to unmute yourself. We hope that for each of you, this session will be the start of a conversation that leads to action just beyond Race Awareness Week. In closing, the patterns of race representations as well as gender and class demonstrate the longevity of racialized hierarchies of privilege in our country. Approaches to regulate, stimulate, and steer the economy are critical matters to contemplate as a university community embedded within broader South Africa. We look forward to your engagement. Enjoy. Geniet het. Itumele. Lethabeng le rona.
Well, greetings to everyone and welcome to this special session, which I'm sure as you've already heard from the introduction video, is part of the Race Week at NWU. And this morning will be addressed by Professor Nomalanga Mkhize, whom I'm going to be introducing shortly. So my name is Glenn Ncube, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Pretoria, where I teach African and global history, and that's where I am now. Unfortunately, and I'm very sorry that you can't see me because of webcam breakdown. So I'll be coordinating this session this morning, and I'm very thrilled and honored to be doing that. So, ladies and gentlemen, please note that this will be a 1.5 hour recorded session, and that the recording will be uploaded on the university YouTube channel for your convenience and use at a later stage. So ladies and gentlemen, this is how the session will unfold. We'll start by watching a pre-recorded lecture by Professor Mkhize, and the title of that lecture, and as you are already aware, is as follows: The End of Azania, How the Global Corporation Killed the Ancient African Market Economy and Lessons for Today. So as the video unfolds, you very, very welcome, as you have already heard from the intro, video, that you very, very welcome to, post your comments, your reflections and questions on the chat box, and, try and get some time at the end of the session to go over those and get, Professor Mkhize to respond to some of them. So you do not have to wait for the question and answer session at the end to post your comments. You can do so as you watch the video. So soon after the video has ended, the lecture has ended, I will just briefly engage, Professor Mkhize, highlight some of the, issues that, perhaps you could speak more to, perhaps some drawing from some of your expectations, and that would last for about 10 to 15 minutes, and thereafter I will open the room for everyone's participation. You're welcome at that moment to stick up your hand. You will be unmuted, and then you'll be given the floor to ask a question, to pass a comment, or a reflection, and then the engagement will continue like that. But before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to give Michelle Groenewald a few minutes to say something about the lucky draw that will come towards the end of the session. Michelle?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Glenn. Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to see that so many of you have attended live. There is just a special announcement for this lucky draw. So we have a lucky draw for 10 gigs of data in each one of the sessions. But Prof Mkhize has so her thank you gift from the university is a 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher, and she has asked that she would please like to donate her thank you gift to one of the students in the session. So we're going to do 2 lucky draws. So thank you so much, Prof Mkhize, for being so generous. I'm sure the students in the session are extra excited now. So we would please just like to ask, because we're going to do 2 different draws, one for the data and then one for the 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher. If all of the students could please, in the chat box right now, just put their name and their student number. And then we're going to work in the background to put all of that into a hat. And then Haley is going to do the lucky draw for us for that as well at about 11:25 when we're close to closing off the session. So if all of the students that are in the session could please then just put their name and student number into the chat box. And other than that, yes, please do enjoy the pre-recorded video from Prof Mkhize. And as we've said, please feel free, as she is busy with her contribution, type chats, questions, comments, reflections into the chat box. Enjoy the video.
Thank you, Michelle. So just briefly, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Mkhize is a historian who is based at the Nelson Mandela University in PE, or Gqeberha, as you know that the name has changed now. She believes the study of human history promotes curiosity and helps us to explore the human condition. She has published a book, a kid's book on African history in English and Dutch in the Netherlands. She has taught a course on the history of the corporation and how it shaped South African history. And her research interests are in the historiography and 19th century African writers. So briefly, that's, who our guest speaker is, and I think you'll hear more about her work and the content in the video that's going to start playing shortly. Please enjoy.
For this discussion, I'm not an economic historian, but a historian is a historian of everything. I just happen to have an interest in world history, like most people that do history. So when I was invited, I thought, let me do a world history topic, but sort of rooted from where we are sitting. The title of my talk is The End of Azania, How the Global Corporation Killed the Ancient African Market Economy and Lessons for Us Today. The Ancient African Market Economy and Lessons for Us Today. Now, I'm not sure if my presentation is doing enough about the lessons, because the story of the emergence of the global economy is so big. But let's see what we can do in the 20 minutes that we have. That is the motto for Nelson Mandela University, Change the World. So I'm hoping that together with our ability to understand history, we can change our world. What you see in front of you here is a famous map from the Middle Ages called the Catalan Atlas from about 1375 AD. Now, those of you who don't do history, you need to know that the way that we mark dates is most commonly we use the terms BC and AD. AD means the year of our Lord, meaning the period that we're in today. So this will be 1375, meaning 1375 years after the death of Christ. This is the Middle Ages, the famous Middle Ages of Europe. And there is this famous map that depicts a part of the world in this era. You can see Italy here. You can see the Mediterranean here. And what you see here is North Africa. So these people were beginning to really try to draw accurate maps of the world. And what we are interested in here on this map, in this depiction of this ancient map, is right here in this corner here. This image, which when I show you now, you will probably have seen it before. And this is an image on the one side. You see, I guess, a person riding a camel. This is relevant to our understanding of Africa at this time. And you see this man here holding this gold orb, this golden staff, wearing this golden crown, very prominently colored in that golden hue. And so, of course, this is a picture of the famous Malian ruler, Mansa Musa. And this image you see in many, many depictions of him. And so it comes from this particular map of the time, giving him quite a bit of prominence on the map, and drawing attention to the stature and significance of this man in this region on the map that he's depicted in. Now, the importance of this map, which is a medieval European, I think Spanish map, is that it is demonstrating this awareness, this importance of this Black man to the medieval European world. And alongside him, because this is a depiction of this part of North, sort of Sahelian Africa, sort of the desert part of Africa, this depiction of the man or person on the camel demonstrates that there's an awareness and understanding of how people were moving and traveling up and down the African desert in North Africa at the time, conducting trade. But here, this man here that is sitting here, he exemplifies the imagination of the time in Europe. They understood that there were these powerful rulers, these powerful Black African rulers in West and what we call Africa of the Sahel, just on the edges of the Sahara Desert. And that this man is being given a very dignified and opulent representation of who he was, because that is who he was. Why is this man on this map, and why is he important to the Europeans of the time? Well, because at the time, not only was this man famous in a legendary fashion because of his vast amounts of wealth and the vast amounts of wealth of the Malian Empire that some of you would have heard of, but also because the gold that this empire was selling and was excavating and harvesting in its territories was the gold that went across the world to be used in European cathedrals, to be used in making ornaments, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. Important for you is to know that Europeans are very aware of this African ruler and his importance, and this is the Middle Ages. It's very important to get that sense of a world in which the relations between Europe and Africa are quite different. And the sense of an Africa, of an entirely sort of barbaric or childlike Africa that we contend with in the colonial era is a much later understanding of Africa than the one of about 800 years ago, when what was important to the Europeans are these African empires that are trading with them and trading this gold that they need because, you know, they had to line their cathedrals or whatever with it and trade with it. I don't want to go into the whole story of the West African trade, because I think it's quite famous and very well known that in ancient West Africa, from about the 700s and 800s, there was a boom, a rise in the trade in gold and salt, in all kinds of goods, spices coming into Africa from the East, and we see the flourishing of these West African kingdoms sort of culminating in the likes of Mansa Musa in the 1300s. I think that's quite a well-known story, with the rise of the Islamic Renaissance of the era impacting on Africa as well. And also the rise of the ability for people to use iron weapons to really begin to build stronger, more resilient luxury trading empires in Africa at the time. But it is important, I think, as I say, for that to remain at the back of our minds when we think about the importance of shifting our understanding of where Africa was situated in the ancient world versus where we think Africa is situated now in the contemporary world. I use some of my writings, you'll find them online, to kind of put this together, because I've expressed my ideas more simplistically in other times. Prior to the emergence of Western-dominated global order in the 15th century, for over 6,000 years, global trade for desired commodities, luxury goods, agricultural surpluses was much more an Afro-Eastern economic affair, where the Mediterranean, Sahara Desert, Indian Ocean, and overland routes into Asia were highways of human, cultural, and economic exchange. Independent African or commodity production was key to global trade. We know that in that era that one might call the classical medieval Middle Ages era, Africa was considered a very key and equal partner in global trade, in which trade, from our perspective, was largely an Afro-Mediterranean and Afro-Asian affair. And of course, this will shift in the 1400s and 1500s, when trade really in the world becomes hegemonically a kind of a Western kind of dominated. You will have studied at school about the ancient kingdoms of Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe, which really flourished at exactly the same time as that Mansa Musa empire. These empire is located further up north on this side of the continent. So if you look at this map of Africa here, Mansa Musa is more on this side, sort of northwestern side of Africa. They are responding to the same kinds of global demands for commodities. And so you see here, when we talk about Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe, these Middle Ages African empires were responding very much to the rise of coastal trade along the Mozambican coast, all the way up Tanzania and Kenya, all the way up to send their commodities across, back into the Mediterranean, and also across the world where their commodities were desired. So that golden that golden Rhine of Mapungubwe is really an illustration of the kind of luxury and wealth and opulence and sort of just the flourishing of an ancient renaissance of the time. I don't have pictures here of Great Zimbabwe. I was a bit scared of copyright stuff. So what I've done is I've just used pictures from my kids' book. So that's why you will see these illustrations where I wasn't sure about copyright. But as you know, these ancient African kingdoms that are located here in Southern Africa were very engaged in selling of gold in particular to merchants that would come down the coast all the way inland, trading through trade networks that were set up by indigenous people to shift goods between the interior of Southern Africa, the coastlines, and then all the way up so that these things could get to Asia. And similarly, what Africans wanted in return was usually some of these goods such as porcelain and beads, which have been found all over our archaeological sites here in Limpopo and in Zimbabwe. So in other words, if you're a student and you think, oh, our ancient ancestors, because we find these goods as they were trading with their counterparts at the time in the 1300s began to decline. And so what we see here is a world in which people aren't as close to each other as they have devices, but they're certainly integrated with each other. There's market, there's force of supply and demand feeding markets between Africans and other people in the world. Now, traditionally, this name, this east coast here is called the Zanj, was not traditionally, in the ancient world, it was called the Zanj coast. And we understand that this word came over time to basically be used in relation to that whole eastern seaboard, which Africans were trading their commodities and building these fantastic civilizations. And the word you will see in ancient texts either appearing as Zanj sometimes, the Zanj coast, or some of the texts of the Roman period. Now, and will appear in some of the texts that are associated with the historical writing of this period, which you can find online, by the way. So see that within Greek and other writings, you'll see the word Azania. 2-day sail beyond there lies the last market town of the continent of Azania. This is how it's used in the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea. And of course, for us, this word came more in the contemporary world during the struggles for against colonization and the struggles for liberation in South Africa, and came to be adopted as the name that we use to think of South Africa in terms of a politically free imagination. So we call South Africa Azania in Black liberation politics. It comes from this ancient period. Of course, at the time as well is the rise of the powerful Ethiopian Christian kingdoms, which will really build the foundation of some of the Christian empires of the ancient Kush world. And so you have Islam flowing into parts of Africa, and you have also got ancient Christianity flowing into Africa. What's important all here is these are all African defined movements of ideas, movements of goods. There's no one imposing on Africans. Africans are driving these changes, adopting ideas that they wish to adopt. So Christianity is adopted in a much more ancient period in Ethiopia. And so the Christianity that arrives with missionaries in the 1800s is kind of a younger Christianity to the African continent. There are also internal trade routes, such as the Zambezi region, where there's a famous archaeological site called Ilede, meaning Inkomo Ilele, which just basically is an archaeological site that showed that there was a lot of internal trade. So not just on the coastlines of Africa, but right at the heart of Africa, there's exchange and trade happening at various points in history. What are people trading with Africans? Well, Africans have a lot of gold. In Great Zimbabwe and all those places, gold and other things were mined wherever they were being mined, but these kingdoms controlled ancient gold mining and ancient gold trade, out of which Europeans and Arabs and other states, ancient states, would make coins, would make jewelry, would make religious artifacts, would make gold leaf to decorate their books, would line their cathedrals with this gold. The other thing that was being traded, and I'll speak a little bit more in detail about it, are textiles. In other words, is cloth. In the ancient world, cloth was a very prized commodity because you can imagine that for the most part, making cloth is quite a lot of work, and you want things to wear. So Africans wove cloth out of various plants and in our environments, and had various techniques of making very fine cloths all across West Africa, Central Africa, and also in Southern Africa. Lots of weaving, sort of simple weaving equipment has been found in Limpopo, for example, showing that there was always an indigenous cloth making textile trade. The other thing is ivory, which was being used. I sometimes call it the plastic of its time, which is not nice because it was the shooting of elephants, but it was really used to make any variety of household goods, implements, luxury items, sculptures, and the rest of it, household implements. And then, of course, animals. Animals have been traded, particularly during the Roman period. Where they put on these shows where animals would kill each other, or the gladiators would fight lions and so on. It was a very brutal and bloody ancient trade, but nevertheless, Africans traded in animals as an exotic good for not just in the Roman period, but going right through trading these with India and China. Of course, we still see the trade in animals today in Africa, but it's on a slightly different terms, right? And also very important, the indigenous leather trading sector. So skins being made and tanned right here, and there's quite a lot of for that is the households which were manufacturing ikumba skins, all right? But of course, this changed it quite dramatically with the coming of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade in hundreds. Now, I just want to make it clear that Europeans didn't invent slavery, okay, know that. And that, in fact, a lot of why they came to trade in slaves where they did in West Africa had to do with the fact that slaving had been happening between Africa and North Africa and the Middle East for at least several hundred years. So when Europeans began investigating, how to get stuffs to parts of Africa without having to go through Arab merchants, through the Mediterranean, they wanted to go around Africa to try and find the trade, to try and put the trade points in Africa for themselves, the gold in Africa for themselves. Then they started also trading in slaves because now they had found exactly where the source was, which was in West Africa. And now, of course, I don't want to go into the history of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, which many of you already know about. But what's important is that now, I'm kind of running out of time, but we'll just have to go along. They once they started colonizing the Americas, and in many ways, it was just in places where Arabs had been trading, enslaving between Africans and Arabs, was directly across the Americas. So they could, if you look here on the slide, they can come right here to this part of Africa, so come down from Europe, come right here, people and just cross the Atlantic and put them on their plantations in the Americas. Driving all of this, of course, was a new commodity, which was sugar, all right, the demand for sugar. What this image depicts here is the period in which Europeans are beginning to become much more strong in trading independently with Africans. They are beginning to set little coastal trading settlements along African coast, and then going inland to trade with Africans. Ivory, Africans will take the guns, they'll give them the ivory, and these Europeans are beginning to really establish a new route and pattern of trade that has kind of not been seen before in the ancient world that I have prior to now described. Let's talk a little bit about textiles, about cloth, and the importance of cloth. We know, for example, the importance of cloth as a trading item, as a form of currency and exchange in parts of Africa. But I thought these descriptions would really help students to understand just how much production and trade happened in Africa. The fibers of wine palm were commonly used, most basic cloth, and for currency. The trees were both cultivated and grew wild. In the first decade of the 17th century, this traveler who lived here on the Luango coast, which is along, as you see here, Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, this is how it describes. He says, of their palm trees, which they keep watering and cutting every year, they make velvets, satins, taffetas, damasks, sarsenets, and such like. So you can see that these Africans are using their indigenous plants to produce a range of fibers and textiles for trade and for use. Samuel Brunn in 1612 indicating the care with which trees were planted along the Luango capital, writing that they were planted like grapevines. Let me just pause here to say, across the world, about whatever ways in which they're going to make clothing items and making them out of the lightest but most wearable material possible, including in Africa. But what will shift later on are two things. One is that Europe will come into the market as merchants, and they will at first begin to trade the cloth of indigenous people, particularly India, all right? Taking cloth woven in India and selling it across the world. But as you will know from history, in the 1700s and 1800s, what happens in Europe? You start getting the Industrial Revolution, and the ways in which cloth are being manufactured in Europe by the time that the 1700s and 1800s come about is much more efficient and much more able to produce that much larger quantities than what you see either in India or in Africa. And so, although European merchants at first were responding positively to African and Asian indigenous, in technological breakthroughs because of the Industrial Revolution was going to eventually reverse all of that and lead to a situation where indigenous cloth was going to be now supplanted or taken over by European produced cloth. Okay. It's clear that African textiles were of high quality before the 1800s, at least according to a source of the time. And you can find a lot of evidence for this. But as you know, then the Europeans kind of looked at this ancient map in which there were African commodities, Asian commodities, all going through this Indian Ocean and Mediterranean routes, some of it going overland in what's called the Silk Trade routes. And Europeans looked and thought there has to be a way for us to get around this ancient route and find our own routes to be able to dominate world trade. And so European explorers and merchants then worked out a path of going around Africa and then, of course, around what becomes the Cape of Good Hope, which is where we are, to go and come around here and begin to take over trade all along the Swahili coast, the Portuguese did. And later on, the Dutch would actually be able to travel and conquer pretty much most of this terrain and begin to dominate trade through, as we'll talk about now, the Dutch East India Company being able to take over this ancient trade routes and establish itself, but now as a new kind of trading entity, the New World Merchants. Now, there's a long reason we could go into how Europe itself comes to be technologically and economically dominant enough to begin exploring how they can take over this global trade. But we know that they do. Okay, so we won't go into the questions of how they do it or what the background to it is, but we know that there's so much of what changes in Europe between the Middle Ages, the Renaissance period, and so on, that leads Europe to be in a better position to actually begin to dominate the world. I want you to keep in mind this little place here called South Africa, because really we get caught up in an accident of history. So what happens? Around the 1500s, Europeans begin to invent many new things, one of which is not just the invention of physical things, but they begin to invent new concepts and ideas, such as how to do trade in a way that, because trade is such high risk, how do you trade with high risk, but also get high profits in this world? And what they do is they invent a thing called the company, okay, which today seems like a normal thing for you, but it was invented largely in the 1600s by Europe, who are trying to find a way to figure out how do we raise money so we can take risks to go to the East and still be able to make a profit and get rich off it. And so what they do is they invented this thing called the company, and it is different from the old way of trade in a couple of ways. One is that it has these things called shareholders, who are people in the general public. So they start to sell shares to raise money so that this money can help them to get overseas. And then you as a shareholder will be able to come and get your profits from when they come back from overseas. And because they now have shares, you can now sell your shares to another person. You can say, look, man, I have shares from the Dutch East India Company. I don't want these shares right now. These people are going to be in the East. They'll come back with spices and lots of profits. You buy my shares and take my profits when they come back. And this we see the origins of the modern kind of stock market. They also have another thing which is interesting. Now, in the past, if you were going to go out and in ships and go and trade and sell, you were likely kind of employed, but you were probably not employed in a way that you would recognize as necessary labor. You're probably a slave or a very lowly sort of paid servant. But what these companies do is they create a system in which there are different levels of labor. Professional labor and unskilled labor, people that come work for this company called the Dutch East India Company under contract employment. So you have those who are going to clean the ships, they have soldiers who are going to do whatever, they've got people who are doing all these things on the ships, management, okay, the invention of management. Also important is that these managers that are running the ships are separate from the people who are actually governing the company. And so there's a separation of powers between those who they see as being talented enough to run the company, the ship, and those who must governance decisions. And of course, one last thing that's important, and that these companies, their governments behind them, they're effectively state-backed companies. They have the power of the military. Wherever they go, they can set up military kind of installations. They can come on behalf of their government. So the Spanish government is saying to its companies, when you go out there into this trading routes, you are acting on behalf of the Dutch. Similarly with the English East Indies Company and so on. And they're granted to be the only company, they have a monopoly, they're the only company in their whole state that is allowed to go on this trade routes into the East. So let's talk about the Dutch East India Company quickly. They employed and enslaved thousands of people as part of their operation and enterprise. The number of people who boarded over 4,700 ships bound for the East Indies between 1595 and 1795 were nearly 1 million people. So in other words, the Dutch East India Company probably in its lifetime employed about 1 million people. That's how large the company was over its time. A large proportion of these people were working as sailors, soldiers, cooks, dock workers, laborers, and they died by disease, war, drug, execution during their time working for the company. Okay, and so they are they've employed you, but you're not employed in the best conditions. But then why are you working for them? Of Europe or from wherever you're coming from, and two, the opportunity to a world in which you may just get to India as this poor sailor and maybe escape and get a free life in India or in South Africa. Between 1602 and 1750, the Dutch East India Company became the largest and most aggressive company of its trading era, establishing commercial dominance by force of arms, all right? Over the first half of the 17th century, the Dutch attacked the Portuguese, the Spanish, of their own in Asia under the control of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, or the Dutch East India Company. And so they began to monopolize sale of spice, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and so on for profit. So you have a company, but the company has the power of arms. It comes in by force. It's got it's backed by the state, and it's backed also by these shareholders who've poured money into it. And so you get a fusion of forces pushing these companies and propelling them across the world. And then what you see when you think of that is that you see how that explosive force called the modern company, exemplified by the Dutch East India Company, is going to be far stronger, especially because they're coming out with a deadly technology called the gun. And of course, the guns were available in other parts of the world, but now you have this very explosive dynamic thing coming on a ship, very well managed, very tightly run, with the intent of making a profit and coming in and fighting wars, taking over territory so that it can trade and control trade, right? And so against these forces, the ancient pattern of trade, the ancient African patterns of trade are now responding more to Europeans and the way they are trading than they necessarily are to the ancient Arab trade and the ways in which they used to trade before. Let's jump over Adam Smith. 4 decades before Van Riebeeck's arrival, a Khoi chief called Xhosa was abducted on the shores of the Southern Cape by the English East India Company, and he was made to go and live in Europe. These Europeans come in numbers. Now, I want to talk very briefly about South Africa. Because these companies are trying to dominate Asian and Eastern trade, and they're explosive in how they are put together, the amount of money that they can collect from their shareholders, the kind of backing they get from their governments to go in and really just take over territories so that they can trade with the indigenous peoples. They have an interest also in knowing who are these indigenous peoples, and they commit really crazy crimes like abducting a Khoi chief in the Cape called Xhosa, who they take to England, and in effect, in a way, it's almost an example of trying to get to know this new world which they are beginning to take over. But it's not always good for these Europeans when they get here. We know, for example, that in 1510, the Portuguese tried to come in and take refreshment from the Cape Station, and the Khoi people there basically really just put them through quite a tough battle and slaughtered them because they were considered to be stealing from the indigenous people at the time. However, even though you see this world changing as this explosive companies are coming in, backing of their European government, it becomes clear, particularly to the Dutch East India Company, that they're not going to survive competitively if they're not able to really position themselves somewhere along this eastern route where they can sit down, get food, refresh themselves, need to get stronger and move off into Asia. And so what they do then, the Dutch, is they decide that they're going to permanently make a station in a place that comes to be known as Cape Town, because they need to station their company there in order to be able to be competitive with the rest of the world. How else are they going to get strong enough on ships to be able to attack the Portuguese, attack the Spanish, attack the French, so that they can dominate world trade? So they come and they settle themselves in a place called Cape Town, where there are these indigenous people who've been watching these ships and trading with them, beating the Portuguese here and there. But the Dutch begin to realize that they have to be very forceful about taking over the space if they are going to have a successful company. And this is how South Africa comes to be colonized. And this is how the Dutch come to stay permanently in the Cape. And they do this through the vehicle called the company. So they don't come and colonize by way of bringing soldiers to come and take over terrain. They come and colonize by way of bringing a company that have a strong incentive to want to stay there because of the profits they want to dominate in the East. And so by staying then in the Cape, they have to now really fight the indigenous people, grab large tracts of land so that they can plant their own refreshments. They have to somehow acquire cattle from the indigenous people so they can get meat going. And so this then leads us into the history of South Africa proper, where you see the conquest of the indigenous peoples of the Cape. And then once that happens, the conquest continues until you see the 200-year wars that lead up to the colonization of the Eastern Cape. And then from then on, the whole of South Africa. Now, what is the point of this? The point of the story is to say that the most important structure that has led to the modern world, if we want to think of colonialism, is not the colonial army, it's not the missionaries. It is the corporation or the modern company with its ability to push capital into a space to be able to move this vehicle to go and make investment. The laws of weight is necessarily, but it does that by harnessing any range of forces that it can to be able to occupy and get those resources that it needs to get. Now, for many of you, if I ask, has much of this across Africa? In some ways, not really. But in other ways, I think what we've seen is that the African continent itself has never had a strong enough response to the complexity that these vehicles that are called companies brought into, start my video, thank you. What we've seen is that Africans have never really very well responded in terms of our own infrastructure, in terms of our own ideas, to the complexity of this thing called the company. I mean, we know, for example, that Zimbabwe was colonized by the British South Africa Company under Cecil John Rhodes. So the thing that does the colonization is, in Africa, for the most part, the vehicle called the company, a profit-driven entity with shareholders who are usually just ordinary people, but given the backing of their governments at the time. How should we think about this today? Today, we all just exist and use these formats, you know, called companies. Well, for one, what this thing called a company does is a very efficient way of structuring capital so that you can manage risk and be able to go into business so that you can get, you know, profits. So it seems to be a very good vehicle for doing that if you want to actually grow an economy. This is what the ancient world didn't have. It didn't have this interesting vehicle where you could have, you know, sell stock and exchange all this capital and lead to this dynamism in an economy. But you can't forget the force with which these companies do what they do. And so there's a whole social world in which you have to understand the context of the company. We see this with the rise of the gold and diamond mining companies of South Africa, De Beers and Anglo-American. They have this amazing structure that can do things, generate huge amounts of what we call profit, but it has to have the force of government or whatever to deal with labor, to deal with the things that to enable it. For example, De Beers was a monopoly. To enable it to exist as a monopoly, to build an economy that suits its needs. So what I want to challenge us today is to really think, what should the company do in Africa, given its history? If we adopt these mechanisms from Europe, what should the company be like as a structure in Africa? Two, how should Africans relate to companies that are coming in from the rest of the world, given the history that they usually come in with a certain kind of force of power to take the resources that they need? even though it's a very interesting and efficient structure to build a certain kind of wealth pattern with it, it never is separate from other forces, political, military, social, and the likes. You can never separate the two. I don't know why today's economists do, but you can't. It's just important. They are not, it's not built to be separated. So if you look at Asia today, we know that a lot of the Western companies are able to do business in Asia because the ways in which those governments organize and control labor enables these companies to make a profit. So you're Nike, but you're not separate from the ways in which certain governments are able to give you cheap labor. That's why they've disinvested from the United States, a lot of these companies. So with that in mind, it really is for me a challenge. So how do we reimagine these things? We know that Africans were trading. So Africans responding to the incentives of trade, building up their own ancient trade infrastructure, being famous enough to appear on European maps, but all of that being swept away by this very amazing vehicle that Europeans create, which is the modern corporation, with its social and political forces on one hand, but also its good concepts like separate management from governance, get a hierarchy of labor, those that manage, those that are underskilled. So I'm going to stop there and see if there will be any more conversation on this. For me, the question is, for themselves, how do our economists think about reinventing these paradigms so that we can live within our history, and in some way, maybe one day as Africans find our own economic freedom with a full understanding of the world that brought this kind of system about.
Wow, thank you, Professor Mkhize, and I'm quite sure and confident that, there will be lots of engagement, already there's, activity already on the chat box. We will, get back to that shortly. And I'm sure, people in the room will begin to ask questions as well. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, that you can, stick up your hand, under reactions, and then, we'll call on you to take the floor and ask your question just shortly. But I just want to thank Professor Mkhize once again for, this marvelous tour de force, really very eloquent overview, and to me also very, very visually stimulating. I was very struck by, how you introduced this, how you got into it using the visual cartography and, explaining it eloquently. I think that was very, very, fascinating, and particularly also how you towards the end tried to connect, the past to the present, because I saw already there's a question that I'll come back to from one attendee here, about, okay, so how is this relevant? And I think towards the end you really brought, the immediacy of this knowledge and its necessity to the present by connecting the past to the present. We really need to, know this past because, in the present era we're dealing with the legacies of that past. And I think, many students of economics along the education line would, get to know about something called path dependency. That most of what we grapple with in the present, follows a particular path that was taken, before. And so I think that's very, very important. And I also found, very fascinating the overview that you drew for us, about the very, egalitarian nature of, early networks of trade and, interaction and encounters between Africa and other continents. You use the visuals to demonstrate that quite clearly, but also in your narrative you did, give some more detail, and it confirms some of the readings that I've also, done, that indeed, the world prior to 1500s, 1600s, or the 17th century, as you put it, was quite egalitarian in terms of its trade networks, and this was the period of archaic globalization. And by the way, archaic globalization is anything, as you correctly said in the chat box, Professor Mkhize, right from antiquity to around about this time, that you're picking up when you begin to talk about the early modern corporation, or the company, as you call it, and this is when we begin to see some changes. Therefore, then globally, in terms of global trade, in terms of the market, in terms of the institution of the company, and et cetera, and also, most importantly, and I think students of economics would benefit from this, that before industrial capitalism that we are living in now, there was merchant capitalism, and this is where you locate the Dutch East India Company, and as well as other companies that of course were not covered in this lecture because they were busy elsewhere. I'm thinking here about the British East India Company, which you did mention briefly. There was the Muscovy Company from Russia, and there were many other companies, I think, from Britain that were responsible for the early colonization of America. For instance, Virginia, was a colony that was set up by a company, the Virginia Company, Massachusetts, again, by the Massachusetts Bay Company, and many other companies belonging to the European imperial powers of this time. So this was the period of merchant capitalism, and I saw one student posted a chart earlier making reference to omissions of some of this stuff even in mercantile law at his university. But I think the point is that before industrial capitalism there was merchant capitalism, which really set into motion the foundations of some of the forces that we're dealing with today, as you rightly point out. And I think also your lecture speaks to the whole debate, which I'm sure at one point or another students of economics would be exposed to, about the great divergence. And this is the debate between Kenneth Pomeranz and David Landis, John Hobson and others, which tries to grapple with the reason why is it that some nations are rich and some other nations are poor. Why was there a divergence in terms of the economic fortunes of different regions of the world or different nations of the world, particularly from the time that you're talking about, Professor Mkhize, the 17th century going forward, when, as you rightly point out, the world before that was quite egalitarian. There were riches across the world. People were networked and trading, with each other on, almost equal terms before the coming of the modern corporation or the company that then, imposed monopolies. And so this, it's a raging debate. It's still unsettled. Why is it, some nations are rich while other nations are poor? And also, I think what your lecture spoke to for me very eloquently was, and I think again trying to connect this to what students of economics might be familiar with, at one point or another, the notion of institutions that new institutional economists have been grappling with for a few years now. The whole idea that institutions matter, and and this is connected also to this debate about the great divergence, because some of the scholars, stakeholders in that debate have argued that the reason behind the riches or the better development of some nations as opposed to others has to do with institutions. So institutions are the main variable in this whole, issue. But what are these institutions? And I think you have put your finger right on the pulse of one of the institutions that have been key in, explaining this divergence. And have you really gone to great lengths to explain how, it did that, the sort of like force that was mobilized, the institutional innovation of, of this, modern corporation, and how they organized their trade, how they monopolized it, how they pulled it together into the stock market, which we still have, today, and how they sort to manage issues of risk, and sharing risk and sharing profits, and the managerial hierarchy, etc., etc. And I think these are issues that are quite germane to studies in economics. But I just want to hear from you. I mean, you do ask some of these questions right at the end also, but if you can allow me to put them back to you, how do you think Africa should respond to some of the challenges that are posed by the corporation? Because certainly they are still a powerful force, and we can trace it back to this time, as you correctly say. And I remember Nick Robbins, one of the writers on some of these companies, says that the British East India Company and together with the Dutch VOC, were the modern ancestors to the contemporary corporation. But I think this is an important question, which I'd like to hear your thoughts on. How should we respond? How can we respond to this? And then also, if you can speak, more, try to maybe address some of the, questions that I'm, seeing also here. I'll read some of them to you just shortly. But how do you think this, can speak to economics? What do you think really is the importance of this to economic students to really grapple with and understand?
Okay, so I'm not an economist, so I think I make that disclaimer all the time. I find
Right.
these things interesting as world history, so
Right.
I won't speak your language. I should actually get into economics history at some point, but I just study them as a historian of the world. On the first question on corporations, I don't know how we're going to make sense of South Africa specifically because of its unique, and when I say unique, I don't mean exceptional. I mean its specific situation. The two main disruptive events in South African history over the past 300 or 400 years have been largely brought about by companies. The first is the Dutch East India Company in its settlement of the Cape, right? So that's what I touched on as the thing came to an end, that the Dutch came to obviously station themselves to be competitive in that early modern merchant trade system, and they needed the Cape for that. Just, I would say it's not nice to say it, but South African colonialism was quite accidental at that stage. So it's the Dutch East India Company and its formats. The second corporation that changed the history of South Africa was De Beers. It wrecked Black families. De Beers and then its child Anglo. Now those companies may seem like they are, I suppose they're like 200 years or sorry. I'm so sorry, just switch off my phone here. Switch off the phone, I'm sorry. I was on mute all this time, so it didn't make a difference. Those two companies have effectively, in their interests, backed by governments, basically rearranged the social order of South Africa. You want to understand the brokenness of Black families, you look at migrant labor. Why did all of that come about? Because of the industrialization that was brought about by the development of the De Beers monopoly. Okay, townships townships are effectively modeled on the need for, well, not even the need, the formats that De Beers set up in its compounds. Now, I don't know how economists think, but if you don't understand that, how do you understand crime in South Africa? How do you understand the disenfranchisement of particularly generations of Black men and the generation of violence by that system? You want to talk to me about being scared to be hijacked? You want to talk to me about being scared to walk at night in this country? How are you going to get that? Oh, these are not investment questions. Sorry, these are not economic questions. Every time you see a young Black man, you're rolling up your window. This is not normal. It's not normal. We all know it's abnormal. So how do economists think they're going to understand this society? I find it very, very strange when they don't take on the historical and social dimensions of how the South African, this isn't about, I mean, I know that, you know, people study South African economic history and they'll look at, you know, all these structural elements of apartheid, the minerals energy complex. All of that is all good and well, but we're talking here about South African people. We're talking about the disposition of Black South Africans at large and the abnormalization of South African life. Those two companies are responsible for that. The Dutch East India Company is responsible for the decimation of social life in what became the Cape because of the genocide that was perpetrated, right? Now, these can all sound like rhetorical things. We all know these things, but if you want to get to the heart of, okay, so this is how your society is organized and it keeps generating violence. So how are you going to think about what kinds of economic forms will deal with that violence? Now, in Europe, at the end of the Second World War, it was understood that there were two problems. One is that Germany could not make sense of itself outside of a greater European community. So Germany, it was understood, needed help. After they had perpetrated a genocide and after they'd done all of this, it was still understood that to make Europe work, Germany had to work. The other thing that had to be understood was that the German problem was not one of they've got broken buildings. It wasn't that Germany lost a war, they've got broken buildings, let's go fix their buildings. That wasn't the issue. The issue was Germany is extremely, extremely humiliated by what they had done. So to fix Europe, you had to fix the German psychological problem. And if it took economy to deal with that, that's what they did. Now, there's a lot of debate, and I'm sure economists will get into debates about the degree to which the European Union was this, what's the mythology around it. But at the heart of it, that was a key element of the question around how to deal with post-war Nazi Germany. It wasn't just we need to build buildings. It was we need to build a society, and therefore we need to know how to handle the fact that these people have been suffering they not suffering, but that they had perpetrated some kind of a very, very, very intense social crime, and they had to deal with their minds. So that's an answer to the first question. So South African history, and I mean, look, Afrikaner nationalists understood this. Okay, we have this debate all the time. Afrikaner nationalists understood that right. Post 1899, they had to deal with not just, oh, you know, there's a problem of we were defeated by the British in the war. They understood that they had to deal with the social question. Now, of course, it had a reactionary element to it because it was rooted in very reactionary Calvinism, which was very white supremacist. But the principle of knowing that the economic question answers the social question as a necessity to creating a sustainable society is important. So that's on the one side. Oh my God, what was the other question? The other question was, what about today? What to do today? Oh, so then the second question goes to the question of the university system. What is its purpose? And why do economists get put in universities to train future generations of people who dissect, analyze, and make recommendations on what to do with our economy? Just tell me, on what basis do you train a bunch of, largely in your universities, African kids and not tell them that they have a history in which their own people were invested in economic independence and took charge of their own economic direction? What manner of economic teaching is that? Because if you're not teaching the historical rooting and you're not telling the large all these generations of young and upcoming Africans that actually there's a different history, on what are you then teaching them? What is the basis of that? Because these concepts aren't abstract. If you read Adam Smith, as a historian, sorry, not as an economist, so you'll forgive me, but as I read it as a historian, I'm reading a person in his time who's solving a problem. He's solving a problem. And so on what basis are you solving a South African or African economic problem if it's not based on a deep excavation of the historical and also the social normative elements of those societies? Because Adam Smith is based entirely on normative conceptions of his world. So if your economy, and this is what China gets that Africans or otherwise in South Africa specifically, South African universities don't seem to get. China has made up its mind it's not going to lose the second globalization, they've decided. And they will do whatever it takes to make sure that they don't lose it. And this is how, if you engage with high caliber elite business people from China, super well educated in Chinese history, and very clear that they're not losing this game this time. So what are you teaching? Are you telling kids here in this continent that, well, guys, we don't have any, so let's just abstract it and hope for the best. Here's a mechanism, without telling them the history of that mechanism.
Right.
Just to conclude, Glenn, there's the whole human framework depends on an understanding of a context and a deep understanding of the purpose of understanding of that context. Otherwise, then you're just teaching concepts, but what is the purpose?
Absolutely. And I think, the homework here is that people have to learn about the company and where it's coming from and its mechanisms. And these are, as you correctly say, very deeply historical. And I think you in your answer to me, you've already, in my view, addressed a question that I saw from Verona. So I will, sort of skip that. But I would like to take Michelle's hand, and perhaps you could answer, Michelle's question or comment together with. There's a point that was raised by Rashad in the chat box. It talks about the notion of colonial economics. Do you think you can give a few insights there? Yeah.
So I want to say something.
Get to Michelle first, and then I can give you about 4 or 5 minutes before we get to the draw.
Okay, sure. All right.
Michelle.
No, Glenn, sorry, I was just actually clapping hands. I was not raising my hand. So I'm keen for Prof Mkhize to rather respond to some of the comments that have been made in the chat, if she'd like to take some time to delve more deeply into them.
Sure. Proceed, Nomalanga.
I'm not sure about the question about the colonial economics. I think I'm not reading it. I'm not seeing it. But there is a question here by someone. I see someone has their hand up. But I will say that so currently there's a debate in South Africa called should land be expropriated without compensation, right? And that debate has been brought about quite strongly by the economic freedom fighters with a very strong, what they call a Marxist-Leninist framework. Well, we can debate whether it's Marxist or Leninist, I don't know. But here's a question there's 2 questions that I pose on that issue. As somebody who believes that we should be having widespread land distribution in South Africa, but with what you call it, with fair compensation, not necessarily market compensation. This is a question I ask, which is, when you come to Africans and you tell them that the solution to their problem, for example, is a Marxist-Leninist one because it's an anti-capitalist one, because capitalism disrupted us, what do you do with the fact that for the most part, Black South Africans or Africans in South Africa have quite a strong concept of private property. Oh no, okay, but Africans don't have a concept of private property. How's that the case when we look at the history of trade and economics on the African continent? You have patterns of notions of private ownership, which don't necessarily extend to all elements of life. So it doesn't necessarily extend to land, for example, but it may extend to my items. So I have a conception of private ownership. I don't know anyone who's ever been to an African village where you can just walk into someone's house and take their stuff. How does Marxist-Leninism, which is again a European import, speak to the fact that Africans have conceptions of private property ownership? But we have conceptions, as I know you economists will dissect this in ways I don't understand, but conceptions of what is common good, what is communal ownership, what is public, what is private, and all those that historically, right? But if all you teach is the framework that says to be anti-capitalist in Africa, we must then adopt a Marxist-Leninist position, you're ignoring, for example, the fact that we have very strong conceptions of who has custodianship and use of land. So if you're gonna expropriate and give all the land to the state, for example, why are you taking away Mkhize land? It's not the state's land. Mkhizes have a very strong sense of ownership over ancestral lands, which is what happened at Kolobeng. So again, if you training Africans deeply within context, we have to look at the patterns of history that exist, because even the remedies that we've adopted are very alien to the way that Africans really are living their lives. So that's why I was posing the challenge there, that on the one hand, capitalism has been the most destructive thing, but on the other hand, sorry, there's going to be a draw at 11:24. But on the other hand, those ancient African trade patterns illustrate early, very early market-driven economies where people are responding to market incentives. So the industrial world is a different kind of world, but that doesn't mean that Africans didn't understand. I mean, certainly in the Cape, when you just look at the trade in the Cape between Khoi people and Europeans, you're looking there at people who are very clear that this is their market and they're going to adapt and trade there. So the idea that these hunter-gatherers, this nonsensical idea of Africans as unadaptive or whatever, it's just rubbish, right? So, okay, I'll stop there for now and let you continue with questions.
Right. Thank you, Professor Mkhize. We'll come back to you just shortly. So ladies and gentlemen, I'll just hand over now to the draw team for the raffle draw. Caro, I see your hand. Can I take it soon after the draw is over, please?
Glenn, yeah, I think we can take, oh, I see Cora's giving a thumbs up. I think we can take his hand just as soon as we've done the draw. Thanks.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Haile Potgieter. I am the SEC Legal Officer of the Potchefstroom campus, as well as the SRC Academics Officer, and I will be conducting the draw for you guys today. So I have everyone who RSVP'd for the session, student numbers on slips of paper written on in this bowl, and I will be drawing one randomly, and that is then for the 10 gigs of data. And then I also have everyone who sent their student numbers in the chat boxes, student numbers written down on these slips of paper, and that's then for the Take-A-Lot voucher. So I will start with the 10 gigs of data draw then. So I'm going to be drawing one from here now for that. Okay, the student number of the person who won the 10 gigs of data is 3111645. I don't know if you guys can see that. 3111645. So that's the person who won the 10 gigs of data. Congratulations. I will send the student number in the chat box after I'm done with the second draw then as well. And then the student number of the person who won the Take-A-Lot voucher is 38449439. So I will also send that student number in the chat box after I am done here. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a fantastic day further.
Thank you, Haley, and congratulations to the winners. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I take Karu's hand, just to let you know that our session is scheduled to end in about 4 minutes at past. But you know, it might spill over by a few minutes. You're welcome to stay, but if you have to go, that's fine again. But can I take Karu's hand and then we go back to Professor Mkhize?
Great, yeah, thanks. Prof Mkhize, you made a very important point that the economic questions that we're looking for answers our social questions. So in that context, what would you say should be the role of the company in Africa?
Thanks. I knew that somebody was going to ask that question. I thought I'm going to be prepared for it, but I think firstly, we need to ask the right economic, Michelle's laughing at me. First, we need to ask the right social questions. Because the social questions, so for example, it's 1914 and I'm an Afrikaner intellectual. I look around me and I'm like, the social question is white poverty in the rural areas, okay? And they're concerned with white poverty. Whatever you want to make, of course, we know problematic, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying, this person is like, white poverty is a problem. And then with that, they begin to devise a kind of state framework over the next 20 to 30 years in the early part of the 1900s, especially Herzog, okay, it's JBM Herzog. I'm not giving plaudits to white supremacists. I'm just learning from my enemies, guys. Okay, JBM Herzog looks at this and he's like, no. We're gonna need mechanisms that are going to reach a person who is sitting as a Baywoner somewhere on a farm in the Karoo. And if we can solve the problem of the Baywoner, then I'm solving white poverty as it was affecting Afrikaners post the war, okay? So he knew that poverty was a Baywoner question. Okay, they had other questions about, when they're watching, young Afrikaans women going into the cities and all of that, but that wasn't the question. I think the real question was, how do you solve the problem of a Baywoner per se? I think this is the consciousness these people had, And as you know, of course, it's a different type of situation, again, dealing with the particular question of how that question was resolved, because we're not positioned in the same ways by history, but I think the intelligentsia of the Afrikaans intelligentsia used to ask these questions in a realistic fashion. They were not politically correct, I think, about these things. And yes, it's over 100 years ago, but I think they were much more aggressively honest about what the real question was. So when I think about an economics question in South Africa, it's not really popular to say this, but I think the economics question in South Africa is how to create a situation where young Black men can become economic adults. That's the Baywoner question of our time. Because if you have a society which has, as I've said, has had all this destruction, you see the main crisis point in South Africa is the inability to make economic adults of young Black men. Now, of course, that's a structural question. So we can say, but that's not a question for young Black men only, Nomalanga. That's a question for South Africans in general, how we're going to make more jobs. But here's the problem. If you're just thinking from a jobs perspective and it's an abstract thing and it doesn't have a direct resonance with who in society are we trying to reach, at the point at which the society will become able to be healthier if we reach this person, what you have then is a situation where you are solving the problems only in a way that's going to kind of hold things together, but never give a base for strengthening your how can I put it? You can't strengthen the basis of your transformation project if you can't see that your fundamental social crisis in South Africa is a young Black man who cannot be integrated economically, because that person becomes the impact of the social ills on that person reverberate 20 times more in that society than if, for example, you're not reaching a young Black woman. Now, of course, I'll be told that's not a feminist argument. If you educate a woman, you educate a village. Not in this country. So, for example, the definition of employment, which I know you guys deal with, but for example, the idea of the informal economy, I've been trying to work through this concept of an informal economy. I'm like, but what is an informal economy in South Africa? Yes, we see our mothers, our aunts, our whoever on the streets selling, honest, hardworking South Africans doing the best they can. But the informal economy in South Africa is the economy in which the disposables have to go into. So the economist telling us people are employed in the informal sector, for me, is nonsensical, because you're actually saying this is the sector we don't want to study well enough and see. And when they do study it, they want to study only this side of the informal economy, not the back end. They want to study the back end. The young man that pulls the stuff off my house, who comes and rips off the metal of my house, and then goes and sells it to the scrap dealer, that's the informal economy you're talking about, but you can't even see the back end of that and the social complexity of the informal economy back end. So when the mining sector declined in South Africa, and then we said, oh, people were then self-employed in the informal economy, really? But I see you having higher and higher fences, but you're not making the connection as the economist. What is the informal economy? Whose definition? It's nonsensical. It doesn't make any difference to our society. So those are so the company needs to, so when you talk about company, you must ask, what's the social question? Now, then I can think, because I said I've been thinking about this. Well, what must that do? At this point, I suppose I'd need a whole nother session, because I don't want to take too much time. We're at the end, but I have thought that one of the main weaknesses in this country is a tax infrastructure in the form of SARS that sees its main goal as being taking as much as it can out of these corporate structures or whatever, out of South Africa, because out of their profit. So trying to collect tax, which is important, and that's fine. I think we should be taxed high. But that taxation infrastructure doesn't seem to know how to speak to the people that you call the informal economy, or the people that you call young entrepreneurs, in a very constructive manner. So if you're young, or anyone who's a young entrepreneur here will know, there's nothing like a nightmare called SARS. And so I've thought to myself, what would it look like if somebody actually just said, and it's not just about saying SARS is a, what's the word we normally use? Like the tax system in South Africa is anti-business. That's not the point. It's that your infrastructure doesn't enable the most fragile economic participant to not only be visible, but rewarded if they're visible, and made to feel like they're part of generating part of the broader welfare of the society. So Makhumalo on the streets is not visible to SARS at all, because SARS thinks their job is only to make sure that Makhumalo's mom gets a grant. And that's fine if they want to see it that way. But to me, it seems that there's a whole impossible situation where to generate grass from the ground up, a support mechanism that sees the self-employed or the young entrepreneur, our system doesn't have a way of seeing that person at all. So it can't support them, it can't validate them, it can't give a grant to them for business. It's all now just left to NYDA or your local municipality. Come with a proposal, we'll see you then. You can't tell me SARS can't see 60 million South Africans when SARS is built to be able to see 60 million South Africans. SARS should know that this person is productive, but they just don't make enough money. And that should give us the basis for what we think about economic activity in South Africa. So that's how I see it. This is something I've thought about, but again, I'm not an economist, so I don't work in that realm of the mechanisms and the policy frameworks. I come from a totally sociological point of view.
Right, fascinating, Professor Mkhize. So there's one last question from Hao, and I'll request that is, respond to that question. Perhaps at the end you can also, do your concluding remarks, just to wrap up. How can you proceed?
Thank you. A fascinating presentation indeed, actually very educative. What I want to, actually what then it gave rise to rather, was the question of what then, now let me start here. Given the history of a company, how the company started, and particularly the features, the characteristics of a company, one of the main characteristics of a company being the state behind the company supporting it. What is it that the former colonies, including South Africa today, has not been able to learn and to think that companies can survive without state support? I mean, whether small companies in South Africa, when small companies have been supported, we complain of cronyism, we complain of corruption sometimes, we complain of cadre deployment, etc., etc. But the successful companies today, all of them have got this vehicle tire called the state or the government supporting it. How then do we hope that as South Africa, we can, or any company will survive without state support? Thank you.
Yes, but that's exactly my point about SARS as an example of our most effective infrastructure in dealing with fiscal questions, and yet it cannot see the young entrepreneur, exactly that one, who, if they had a track record of them, SARS should be able to say to DTI, here is how on our system we need to send a grant because they are a young entrepreneur and we're able to collate what their activities have been. That's exactly my point. So there is no such thing as we can do this without state support. But also state support has been, and I think it's because, and can I just say something quickly, Professor Ncube? BEE was not the Black people's idea of transformation. When BEE was being pushed in the early 90s, it was precisely the mass base of especially the labor unions, the trade unions that rejected BEE. Today, the right wing is rejecting BEE, but it was their idea. It was their idea to co-opt a small segment of Black South Africans. And when the masses were saying this does not solve the problem of the masses, they wouldn't do that because they were trying to co-opt a small class of Black people, and it collapsed. And then today, BE has become synonymous with all the failure of Black transformation, which are not, no, it was a white right-wing idea to begin with. It was. And so, again, history is important. I don't want to hear someone tell me, yeah, BE is failing there and the CEO is the owner of Capitec. It's like, well, let me go back into your files and check if you didn't support it at the beginning when you thought this would keep the masses quiet. So BE was never a Black people's concept of transformation. What was this idea that we had to find a mass solution. And unfortunately, it's no one's fault. We got caught up in the deindustrialization processes of the 1990s as manufacturing moved to Asia. And so we lost all our jobs, all our factories, all of that. So there is no such thing as you can do it without. South Africans have been subjected to the most harsh economic forces over the past 27 years. It's not because we're lazy or we are unable to hold a thing together. We have succumbed to the idea that we have to be subjected to them. But because the state support mechanism was codified in the Black economic elite transformation program, and maybe we thought it was a good idea to some degree, but it clearly didn't work. There has been state support, but the state support was misdirected. So hence I wanted to start by saying the right wing is what pushed BEE in this country. They pushed it when it was rejected by the masses. Then it was adopted because Mandela was being threatened left, right, and center, that we could not go the so-called, anything for Black people, is called socialism, even if it's a good idea. So we can't go that route. You can't, you have to build up a Black business class and make them work out. it cannot work that way. We now know that it cannot. And that's why what you have is a serious de-skilling of the Black business base by its excessive focus and our focus on the government patronage or tender system, which doesn't actually transfer or confer on Black companies actual real productivity. So the Black companies need to be conferred with states of work that provides with productivity. So there's a question about from Habib there. So I need to answer this claim because again, in this politically correct world, you're going to be told you are being unfeminist. It doesn't help a country when you place your economic burdens on women. It doesn't help your country. It doesn't help South Africa. All our mothers died of COVID because they have high blood pressure. Go into any Black household and see the stress that the women in those houses are holding together. Go to any tavern and deal with the men who have lost all their hope and all their dignity and go home and terrorize women. Tell me about that first. These are social questions. They're not abstract. So these liberal kind of, let's find the ultimate victim, a Black woman, and then let's see how we can position her as the solution. Hell no. If you cannot get my brothers to work, if you can get my uncles to work, and yet I'm working and I'm dealing with a bunch of highly dispossessed Black men, what we have is terror in our households. So no, we're not going to go the liberal route. This was the point of this lecture, that we're not going to take someone else's framework for how to understand the destructive gender relations in our society. We're going to look at what actually happens. We're going to educate Black women because they have to be educated any case as people, because a society that doesn't actually educate women becomes highly moribund. It doesn't grow fast, it stagnates in some way. But a society that cannot solve the problem of what to do when Black men or when men are highly dispossessed either economically or financially, you will have a problem in your household and in your community, and that becomes a social problem you cannot contain, which is what you're dealing with in South Africa. None of you are afraid of Black women when you see them. None of you. None of you are scared of me. What you're afraid of is the potential that you're going to have a highly dispossessed young Black man break into your house, and all the 400 years is going to spill upon you punitively. That's what you're afraid of. So, and you guys there, I believe you've got a problem on the farms and with the high murder rates and all of that. These are social questions that cannot be solved outside of the society's history and how it produces human beings who have nothing to lose, who have a lot to gain if they, take high dangerous risks. So that would be my answer. I think again, because I'm not an economist, one day I'm going to study economics and I'm going to enter your terrain, Prof Ncube and all these people, and then I'm going to use your words and your models and your abstractions to answer some of these social questions. I'm going to come in and then I'm going to say, change this language. But I think some of the models that economists use are quite helpful for helping us to at least develop the models. So what I'd like to see is developing the models that make sense to the South African problem, as it is a South African problem and a SADC problem, and then an African question within the global setting. Rather than presume, and that doesn't mean we don't, I pretty much go with the Chinese on this. Take that paradigm, bring it here, test it. Does it work? Does it not? So we're not saying we are our own wise people. We are wise, but we borrow that wisdom that others also bring to us. And so we are not insular in that sense.
Oh,
please,
thank you.
Colleagues,
yeah.
Black women are not going to carry this country forever. Stop it. We're not going to do it for you forever just because you go around telling us you educate a woman, you educate a village. Hell no, we're tired. We've been carrying it for 100 years, watching Black men become totally intergenerationally dispossessed. You've got to solve that problem if we're going to survive and not die of heart attacks, high blood pressure, swekile, yonke lento esibulalayo asidikiwe kukufa kaloku nathi.
Right, thank you, Professor Mkhize. I wish we had, more time. We're already beyond our schedule because there's lots that still needs to be mulled over, debated, and wrestled over. It's really complex and complicated. But I think you've really, opened up room for debate here, some avenues and frontiers to pursue, and what the different disciplines can learn from each other. By the way, I'm a historian myself, with a training in economic history. So thank you so much indeed for this talk. I already saw in the chat box here somebody called Pauline saying, rethinking my entire degree. So that's impactful. That's how impactful your talk was, Professor Mkhize. So thank you so much for this. And thanks to Michelle as well for coordinating this session. Very much impressive. And thanks to the technical team as well. It was very, very amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks particularly to you, all the attendees, the students involved, the questions that you posted, on the chat box, the questions that you asked. And I think, it made the session to be as lively as it could be. But do you remember, that this, I've been told, is just one of, numerous other sessions, to join this week. So you're welcome to join other sessions again this week. You can check out, the details on the NWU web page. Otherwise, this is the end of the session. Thank you so much to you all.